Greg, Amy, and Jason had spent months planning their first real wilderness hike, choosing a trail recently opened to the public. The online reviews were glowing: pristine paths, untouched natural beauty, and an unparalleled sense of solitude. But no one mentioned the stories that followed those who ventured too deep. The trail had appeared on hiking forums 6 months ago, drawing attention for its pristine conditions and mysterious past. Some speculated it was part of an old logging route. Others claimed it dated back to Native American paths, but official records were surprisingly sparse. What drew them in were the photographs: magnificent vistas untouched by modern development, ancient trees reaching toward cloud-strewn skies, and crystalline streams that seemed to whisper of wilderness long forgotten. There had been one review, buried deep in the comments section, that gave Amy pause during their planning. The user had posted a single cryptic warning: "The path changes when you're not looking. Don't trust your eyes." But the account was deleted shortly after, and Amy had dismissed it as typical internet dramatics. Now, standing at the trailhead, that comment surfaced in her mind like a half-remembered nightmare. It started well enough. They arrived at the trailhead early, the morning sunlight cutting through the trees in golden beams that painted dappled patterns across their faces. The parking area was empty save for their car, which somehow didn't surprise them. The trail's remote location had been part of its appeal. Jason, ever the gearhead, had insisted on bringing the latest GPS equipment, despite Amy's protests. His backpack bulged with backup batteries, satellite devices, and enough electronic equipment to stock a small camping store. "Seriously, we won't need it," she said, tightening the straps on her pack. The webbing made a soft zipping sound as she adjusted it, her movements precise and practiced. "We're not bushwhacking here. It's a marked trail." Her voice carried a hint of exasperation, but beneath it lay something else, a thread of anxiety she couldn't quite explain. The morning air felt different here, thicker somehow, as if it were trying to tell them something they weren't equipped to understand. "You say that now," Jason retorted, holding up the GPS with a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. The device's screen cast a pale blue glow across his face, making him look somehow older in the early morning light. "But just wait until I save us from some horror movie scenario." The words hung in the air a moment too long, their attempted humor falling flat against the looming wall of trees before them. Even as he spoke, the GPS screen flickered briefly, numbers and coordinates dancing in ways that defied the device's programming. Greg laughed, slapping Jason on the back with forced cheerfulness. Let him have his toys. Better over-prepared than under, right? He adjusted his own pack, the weight settling heavily across his shoulders. At 42, he was the oldest of the three, though he tried not to let it show. Still, something about the trail made him grateful for Jason's preparedness, even if he couldn't articulate why. His years of experience in the outdoors had taught him to trust his instincts, and right now, those instincts were screaming at him to turn around. Amy rolled her eyes, and they started off, their boots crunching over the packed dirt. The sound seemed to echo oddly in the still morning air, as if the forest itself was listening to their intrusion. The trail snaked gently through the forest, bordered by towering pines and dense underbrush that seemed to press in around them. Birds chirped overhead, their songs familiar yet somehow discordant, and the air smelled of damp earth and pine needles. It was exactly what they'd hoped for, a serene escape from the noise of city life. Yet with each step, the weight of the forest silence seemed to grow heavier. Greg noticed it first, the way the trail seemed to wind differently than what their topographical maps had shown. The elevation changes were subtle, almost imperceptible, but they were there. Slopes that should have gone up went down. Curves that should have bent left went right. He kept these observations to himself, not wanting to alarm the others. But he began marking trees with his knife as they passed, small notches that would help them find their way back. The The first few hours passed uneventfully, marked only by the steady rhythm of their footfalls and the occasional creak of their packs. They stopped for lunch near a small stream, its waters running clear and cold over moss-covered stones. As they dipped their water bottles in to refill, Amy noticed how the water seemed to move just a fraction too slowly, as if the laws of physics worked differently here. She said nothing, chalking it up to imagination, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the stream was watching them, its gentle burbling carrying messages they weren't meant to understand. Jason pulled out the GPS to show their progress, the device's synthetic beeping an alien intrusion in the natural quiet. "We're making great time," he said, though his brow furrowed slightly as he studied the screen. "According to this, there's a nice clearing about 2 miles ahead. Should be perfect for setting up camp." He didn't mention how the trail's path on his screen seemed to shift slightly each time he looked away, the documented route subtly realigning itself when he wasn't watching. The battery indicator, which had shown full charge that morning, was already down to 60%, far too fast for normal use. Greg nodded, stretching his legs. His joints popped loudly in the stillness. "Sounds good to me. Let's get moving before we lose the light." He gazed up at the canopy, where the sunlight seemed to have taken on a strange, filtered quality, as if passing through something more than just leaves. The shadows cast by the branches above formed patterns that seemed almost deliberate, like ancient symbols written in a language of darkness and light. Amy glanced at her watch, the familiar action grounding her in normalcy. "We've got plenty of daylight left. Relax, Dad." But even as she spoke, she noticed how the shadows beneath the trees seemed to stretch longer than they should, reaching toward them like grasping fingers. Her watch face caught the light strangely, the hands moving with an irregular tick that made her stomach turn. She quickly covered it with her sleeve. Greg smirked, but something in Amy's tone made Jason glance at her. She'd been unusually quiet since they set out, her usual sarcasm muted. The forest seemed to have drawn something out of her, replacing her typical confidence with a watchful wariness that set him on edge. He'd known her since college, and he'd never seen her like this. Her usual sharp wit dulled by something that seemed to press against the edges of their awareness. "You good?" Jason asked, trying to keep his voice casual, even as goosebumps raised along his arms. He noticed how she kept looking over her shoulder, her eyes tracking movement that wasn't there. "Yeah," she said quickly, too quickly. Her hands fidgeted with her pack straps, a nervous habit she thought she'd broken years ago. "Just something feels off. Probably just me being paranoid." The words felt hollow even as she spoke them, like lies told to children about monsters under the bed. She wanted to tell them about the whispers she'd been hearing, sounds just below the threshold of understanding that seemed to follow their movements through the trees. Jason shrugged it off, but as they packed up and continued, the sense of unease began to spread between them like a contagion. The trail seemed to stretch endlessly, each curve revealing more trees, more shadows, but no landmarks. The GPS, however, continued to insist they were on track, though Jason had stopped sharing their progress aloud. The device's cheerful, "You are here" marker seemed more like a taunt with each passing mile, especially when he noticed it sometimes showed them moving in impossible directions. The forest around them began to change in subtle ways they couldn't quite pin down. The trees, which had seemed merely tall before, now loomed impossibly high, their upper branches lost in a canopy that appeared to absorb what little sunlight remained. The underbrush grew thicker, pressing against the trail's edges with an almost conscious malevolence. Branches seemed to reach for them as they passed, catching on their clothes with thorns that hadn't been visible moments before. Greg's trail markers had disappeared, though he was certain they hadn't strayed from their path. The notches he'd carved into the trees were gone, replaced by strange organic patterns in the bark that looked almost like faces caught in expressions of silent screaming. He kept this observation to himself, but his hand never strayed far from the knife at his belt. By the time they reached the clearing, the mood had shifted completely. The golden light of morning was gone, replaced by the dull, gray-blue hues of late afternoon that seemed to leach the color from everything it touched. The clearing was as promised, wide and flat, with just enough open sky to see the stars later. But it felt wrong, silent. The birds that had filled the forest with song earlier were gone, leaving only the faint rustle of leaves in the wind, a sound that seemed to carry whispers just below the threshold of understanding. "Let's get the tents up," Greg said, his voice unusually subdued. He surveyed the clearing with the cautious gaze of a man who had spent enough time in the wilderness to know when something wasn't right. The grass beneath their feet was too uniform, too perfectly circular, as if the clearing hadn't formed naturally, but had been carved out by something with purpose. Looking closely, he could see that the grass didn't move quite right in the wind, each blade swaying in perfect unison, like dancers in a choreographed performance. As they began to unpack their gear, the sun seemed to sink with unnatural speed, as if eager to abandon them to the gathering darkness. The temperature dropped sharply, their breath beginning to fog in the cooling air. Jason checked the GPS one last time, the screen's blue glow casting strange shadows across his face. According to the device, they were exactly where they should be. But as night approached and the stars began to appear overhead, stars that seemed to move in patterns that defied astronomy, all three of them knew, with a certainty that went beyond rational thought, that they were somewhere else entirely. Amy was the first to notice that the trail they'd arrived on was gone, replaced by an unbroken wall of trees and undergrowth. When she pointed this out, Jason frantically checked the GPS, but the screen had gone black despite its full battery. Greg pulled out their paper maps, but the landmarks and contours depicted on them no longer matched anything they could see in any direction. The trail that had led them here was supposed to be their way back tomorrow. But as they huddled around their hastily built campfire, watching shadows dance at the edge of the clearing, they all shared the same unspoken fear. The path they'd followed no longer existed, replaced by something older, something hungry, something that had been waiting for visitors for a very, very long time. A twig snapped in the darkness beyond their fire's light, and three heads turned in unison toward the sound. The forest watched them with ancient patience, knowing they would have to leave the clearing eventually. After all, every path, no matter how endless it might seem, leads somewhere. The question was, where did this one lead, and what was waiting at its end? In the distance, through the trees, they thought they saw lights, other campfires perhaps, or the headlamps of fellow hikers. But something in their gut told them those lights weren't meant to guide them to safety. They were meant to lead them deeper, to places where the trail's true nature would finally reveal itself, where the whispers in the wind would become clear, and where those who ventured too deep would understand why some paths were never meant to be followed. Greg tightened his grip on his knife. Amy closed her eyes against the darkness that seemed to pulse with its own life, and Jason's hands shook as he tried one last time to power on the GPS. The night pressed in around them, and somewhere in the forest, something began to move, its footsteps matching the rhythm of their racing hearts. The path had chosen them, and now they would learn why no one ever wrote reviews about what lay beyond the first day's journey. Jack had chosen this hike for its solitude, a quiet stretch of woods far from the beaten path, where he could spend a weekend alone with his thoughts. After months of back-to-back deadlines and late nights at the office, where the fluorescent lights buzzed like angry wasps, and the walls seemed to close in with each passing hour, he craved silence, the kind only the wilderness could provide. His colleagues had thought him mad for wanting to spend his first free weekend in months alone in the woods. "You need to decompress," they'd said, suggesting bars and parties and crowded restaurants. But Jack knew better. The crushing weight of human interaction, The constant need to smile and nod and pretend everything was fine. It had worn him down to nothing. Here, among the trees, he could finally breathe. The trail was narrow but well marked, weaving through ancient trees that rose like sentinels around him. Their massive trunks were wrapped in rough bark, deeply furrowed with age, each one bearing silent witness to centuries of seasons. Jack walked with a steady rhythm, his pack snug against his back and his boots scuffing the dirt. The air was crisp, tinged with the earthy scent of decaying leaves, and the forest seemed to exhale around him. Occasionally, a jay would call from somewhere in the canopy, its harsh cry echoing through the branches before fading into the ambient rustling of leaves. It was around midday when he noticed the carvings. He had stopped for a quick water break, his muscles pleasantly warm from the morning's hike, when his eyes caught a jagged line etched into the bark of a nearby oak. The tree stood slightly apart from its neighbors, its trunk unusually thick and gnarled. At first he thought it was an accidental scrape, a bear's claw mark, or perhaps a remnant of an old trail marker. But as he moved closer, he saw more of them. The lines weren't random. They formed deliberate shapes, almost like letters, though not in any language he recognized. Some resembled ancient runes, while others appeared more fluid, like flowing script written by an unsteady hand. Jack frowned, running a finger over the marks. They were shallow but precise, too clean to be made by an animal, the edges still sharp as if recently carved. A chill prickled at the back of his neck, raising the fine hairs there. He glanced around the forest, half expecting to see someone, but the trail was empty. The trees stretched endlessly in every direction, their branches swaying gently in a breeze he couldn't quite feel at ground level. Probably just some bored hiker, he muttered, shaking his head. His voice sounded strange in the stillness, too loud and somehow hollow. He capped his water bottle and continued walking, trying to ignore the way the carved symbols seemed to catch his eye even as he turned away. But the carvings didn't stop. As the trail wound deeper into the woods, he began to see them more frequently. Some were etched low to the ground, others high up on the trunks, as if whoever, or whatever, had made them had climbed the trees. They grew more intricate, resembling symbols rather than letters, each set more elaborate than the last. One design in particular, a circle surrounded by jagged lines that reminded Jack of a twisted sun or perhaps a malformed eye, kept appearing, its stark geometry at odds with the organic chaos of the forest. Sometimes the circle was small, barely larger than a coin. Other times it sprawled across the entire trunk, the surrounding lines reaching out like grasping fingers. The afternoon light began to take on a different quality, filtering through the leaves in ways that made the carvings seem to shift and change when viewed from different angles. Jack found himself pausing more frequently, drawn to examine the symbols, despite his growing unease. There was something about them that tugged at the edges of his consciousness, as if they were words on the tip of his tongue, meaning just beyond his grasp. By late afternoon, the sun hung low in the sky, painting the forest in deep oranges and lengthening shadows, and Jack decided it was time to set up camp. He found a small clearing just off the trail, the ground soft with moss, and sheltered by a canopy of interlocking branches. The trees here were older, their trunks wider and more twisted, bark deeply grooved, and, he noticed with a sinking feeling, covered in more of the strange symbols. As he pitched his tent, he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. The weight of unseen eyes pressed against him, making his movements jerky and uncertain. The forest seemed quieter than before. The rustle of leaves and distant bird calls that had accompanied him earlier were gone, replaced by a heavy, almost oppressive silence. Even the wind seemed to have died, leaving the air thick and stagnant. Jack tried to ignore it, focusing on building a fire and heating a can of soup. The flames cast dancing shadows on the surrounding trees, making the carved symbols appear to writhe and pulse in the flickering light. But as the sun dipped below the horizon and darkness swallowed the clearing, the unease grew harder to dismiss. The first whisper came just after nightfall. Jack was sitting by the fire, staring into the dancing flames, when he heard it, a faint, breathy sound that seemed to drift on the wind. He froze, his spoon hovering midair, soup forgotten. It had sounded like his name, spoken with an intimacy that made his skin crawl. Jack. He turned his head sharply, the forest looming like a wall of darkness beyond the firelight. The trees seemed closer now, their carved surfaces gleaming dully in the flickering flames. "Hello?" he called, his voice breaking the silence. There was no answer, only the crackle of the fire and the distant rustle of leaves. The darkness between the trees seemed to pulse, like a living thing drawing breath. He told himself it was just the wind, but deep down, he didn't believe it. The whisper had carried too much intent, too much awareness. It had shaped his name with careful precision, like a lover's caress or a predator's promise. As the hours passed, the whispers grew more frequent. They came from all directions, rising and falling like the tide, a chorus of voices that seemed to emanate from the trees themselves. Sometimes they were soft and pleading, gentle as a mother's lullaby. Other times, sharp and insistent, cutting through the night air like knives. Jack tried to block them out, stuffing his ears with tissue and burying his head in his sleeping bag. But the voices seeped through, threading into his mind like tendrils of smoke. The carved symbols seemed to watch him, their geometries transforming in the dying firelight. The circle and lines design appeared to pulse with a faint luminescence, a sickly glow that made Jack's eyes water when he looked at it directly. The jagged lines around it writhed like living things, reaching toward him with ghostly fingers before retreating back into the bark. At some point, exhaustion overtook him, and he fell into a fitful sleep. His dreams were fragmented and unsettling, a kaleidoscope of shadowy figures and gnarled trees, their bark etched with symbols that seemed to pulse and writhe. In the dreams, the whispers took on form, becoming thick, ropey strands that wrapped around his limbs, pulling him deeper into the forest's embrace. The trees bent toward him, their branches reaching down with terrible purpose, and the symbols blazed with an inner light that burned his eyes. When he woke, drenched in sweat and trembling, the whispers were gone, replaced by an eerie stillness. The pre-dawn light filtered through the trees, casting everything in a gray, lifeless pall. The fire had died to cold ashes, and frost coated the ground in delicate patterns that looked disturbingly like the carved symbols. Jack packed up his camp in record time, his hands shaking as he stuffed equipment into his bag. Each sound he made seemed unnaturally loud in the morning stillness, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The trees loomed over him, their carved surfaces more prominent than ever in the harsh morning light. But as he started back down the trail, he realized the carvings were still there, more of them now, covering nearly every tree he passed. The circle and lines design was the most common, and it seemed to grow more complex the farther he walked, the lines forming intricate patterns that hurt his eyes to look at. He could have sworn some of the carvings were new, the wood still raw and pale, sap beating like drops of blood along the fresh cuts. The whispers returned just before midday, when the sun was high enough to cast sharp shadows through the canopy. This time, they were louder, more distinct, and they weren't alone. The voices overlapped, creating a tapestry of sound that made his head spin. Some spoke in languages he didn't recognize, ancient syllables that seemed to catch in his throat when he tried to repeat them. Jack began to hear footsteps, soft shuffling sounds that seemed to echo his own. When he stopped, they stopped, the silence immediate and absolute. When he quickened his pace, they matched him step for step, a perfect mirror of his movements. He spun around repeatedly, scanning the forest, but saw nothing. No animals, no other hikers, only trees, their carved surfaces glinting in the dappled sunlight. the symbols seeming to shift and change when he wasn't looking directly at them. "Who's there?" he shouted, his voice cracking with panic. "Show yourself." The forest swallowed his words, offering no reply except for the endless whispers that now seemed to come from inside his own head. The carved symbols appeared to be watching him, their geometries containing some terrible meaning he was afraid to understand. By afternoon, Jack was running, his boots pounding the trail as his breath came in ragged gasps. The whispers were deafening now, overlapping and echoing until they became a cacophony of sound that threatened to drive him mad. His name, over and over, interspersed with phrases he couldn't understand, but that filled him with a bone-deep dread. He no longer cared where he was going. He just wanted to escape the voices, the symbols, the feeling of being hunted through his own sanctuary. When he burst into a clearing, the sight stopped him cold. His heart seemed to skip several beats as recognition dawned. It was the same clearing where he had camped the night before. The fire pit was still there, the ashes cold and gray, his boot prints still visible in the frost-covered ground. His heart plummeted as he realized what this meant. He had been walking in circles, even with the trail markers and his compass. The forest had led him right back to where he started, like a cat toying with its prey. A movement caught his eye, and Jack turned toward the trees. A figure stood at the edge of the clearing, its outline barely visible through the haze of afternoon light. It was tall and thin, its limbs impossibly long and jointed in ways that defied anatomy. Its surface seemed to shift and ripple like bark, patterns flowing across it like water. The carvings were there too, etched into its form, glowing faintly as if lit from within. The circle and lines design dominated its center, pulsing like a heart. Jack took a step back, his legs trembling beneath him. The figure didn't move, but its head tilted at an impossible angle, and the whispers surged, louder than ever. They filled his head, drowning out everything else, until he could barely remember his own name. "Jack, stay." It wasn't a request. It was a command, spoken with the weight of centuries, with the voice of the forest itself. The words seemed to carve themselves into his mind, just as the symbols were carved into the trees. He turned and ran, leaving his gear behind, the whispers chasing him all the way back to the trailhead. Behind him, the forest watched through eyes carved in ancient bark and waited for the next visitor who would seek its solitude. The forest surrounding Raven's Hollow was dense, with trees that seemed to twist unnaturally toward the sky, their branches like skeletal fingers reaching through a perpetual twilight. Ancient oaks and birches grew at impossible angles, their bark blackened as if scorched by some long-forgotten fire. Local legends warned against wandering too far from the well-trodden paths, especially after dark. Tales spoke of travelers who ventured deep into these woods, only to emerge days later, their minds fractured by what they'd witnessed, if they emerged at all. But for Leah and Marcus, those warnings only added to the appeal. The couple had been planning their getaway for weeks, eager to leave behind the suffocating noise of the city. Their small apartment had started to feel like a cage, its walls closing in with each passing day. Leah was a budding photographer, always chasing the next perfect shot, her portfolio filled with abandoned places and forgotten corners of the world. Marcus, a history buff who spent his days cataloging artifacts at the city museum, loved exploring old ruins. His colleagues often joked about his obsession with dead places, but he saw beauty in decay, stories in the crumbling stones. When they heard about the forgotten settlement near the Hollow, with its mysterious past and unexplained abandonment, it seemed like the perfect blend of adventure and mystery. "This place is perfect," Leah said as she adjusted her camera strap, scanning the narrow path ahead. Fallen leaves crunched beneath her boots, their autumn colors muted in the dim light. Her fingers traced the worn grip of her beloved Canon, a graduation gift that had become an extension of herself. Creepy enough for some great shots, but not so overdone that it's crawling with tourists. Marcus laughed, the sound oddly muffled by the dense foliage surrounding them. Exactly. Let's find those ruins before the light's gone. His backpack was heavy with research materials, local histories, geological surveys, and newspaper clippings that hinted at the settlement's dark past. The hike to the settlement was longer than they'd anticipated. The trail narrowed as it wound deeper into the forest, the towering trees blotting out most of the afternoon sun. Their branches intertwined overhead, creating a natural tunnel that seemed to swallow what little light remained. The air grew colder with each step, carrying the musty scent of decay and the faint sound of rushing water that echoed somewhere in the distance, its source impossible to pinpoint. "Are we even going the right way?" Leah asked, glancing at the GPS app on her phone. The signal bars flickered uncertainly, and the blue dot marking their location jumped erratically across the screen. Marcus pulled out a printed map, a relic he insisted on carrying for authenticity. The corners were dog-eared, and coffee stains marked the edges, but the details were clear enough. "It should be just ahead," he said, pointing to a faint marking labeled Raven's Rest. His finger traced the path, noting how the topographical lines crowded together, indicating steep terrain. According to the Historical Society, the settlement was built in a natural clearing. When they finally arrived, the ruins were less impressive than they'd hoped. The remnants of a few crumbled stone walls stood like broken teeth against the darkening sky, and the charred skeleton of what might have been a cabin slouched in defeat. Moss and ivy crept over every surface, nature slowly reclaiming what man had abandoned. The smell of damp earth hung heavy in the air, mingled with something else, something acrid and metallic that caught in the back of their throats. "This is it?" Leah asked, raising an eyebrow. She kicked at a fallen beam, watching as it crumbled into rotting splinters. Marcus grinned, his enthusiasm undimmed. "It's history." He ran his hands over the nearest wall, fingers tracing patterns in the weathered stone. "Think about the lives these people lived, before the fire, before the forest took over. The records mention a thriving community here in the 1800s, but something happened, something that made them leave everything behind." Leah sighed but couldn't resist snapping a few pictures. The camera's display showed the ruins in stark detail, the way shadow pooled in unexpected corners, the strange angles of the remaining structures that seemed to defy geometry. As the sun dipped lower, casting the ruins in shadow, she had to admit there was something hauntingly beautiful about the place. Each frame captured a different aspect of decay, of abandonment, of time's relentless march. They were packing up to leave when Leah spotted it, a faint light flickering between the trees. It was far off the trail, deeper into the forest where the shadows grew thick and impenetrable, but unmistakable. The golden glow of a lantern swaying gently in the darkness. The light seemed to pulse with an inner life, like a heartbeat made visible. "Do you see that?" Leah asked, grabbing Marcus's arm. Her fingers dug into his jacket, leaving small crescents in the fabric. Marcus followed her gaze, his expression curious but tinged with unease. "Maybe another hiker." The words sounded hollow, even as he spoke them. Leah frowned, her photographer's eye, noting how the light moved unnaturally, too smooth to be carried by human hands. "Out here? This trail hasn't been maintained in years." She gestured at the overgrown path, where roots and fallen branches created natural obstacles. The lantern moved again, its light bobbing as though carried by an unseen hand. The glow seemed to beckon them, promising secrets in its warm embrace. "Let's check it out," Leah said, already slinging her camera over her shoulder. The strap caught on her hair, and she impatiently tucked the loose strands behind her ear. Marcus hesitated, his historian's knowledge of local legends suddenly very present in his mind. "We're losing light, Leah. It's probably just someone from the town." His voice trailed off as he realized how unlikely that explanation was. "Then why would they be wandering this deep?" She cut him off. excitement overriding caution. "Come on, just a quick look." Her eyes sparkled with the same intensity that had first drawn him to her, that fearless curiosity that sometimes bordered on recklessness. Against his better judgment, Marcus followed. The light led them farther from the trail, weaving between the trees like a moth through the night. Each time it seemed within reach, it would drift farther, as if teasing them. The forest grew denser, the trees pressing closer, their bark rough and black in the fading light. The ground beneath their feet became treacherous, hidden roots threatening to trip them with each step. "This is ridiculous," Marcus said, his voice tight with growing anxiety. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the chill. "We should turn back." "Just a little farther," Leah replied, her focus entirely on the lantern. She moved with single-minded determination, barely noticing the branches that caught at her clothes and hair. Finally, the light stopped. It hovered above the ground, illuminating the entrance to another clearing. This one wasn't empty like the ruins. They could see the outline of a building, its windows broken, and its roof sagging under the weight of years. The lantern floated to the doorway and vanished, leaving behind a golden afterimage in the darkness. "Did you see that?" Leah whispered, her breath visible in the suddenly frigid air. Marcus grabbed her arm, his fingers trembling. "Leah, we need to go." Something about the building seemed wrong, its angles too sharp, its shadows too deep. But Leah was already stepping forward, drawn to the clearing as if in a trance. Her boots left no imprints in the damp earth, as if the ground itself refused to acknowledge their presence. Marcus reluctantly followed, his every instinct screaming at him to turn back. The building was larger than it had seemed at first, its charred wooden walls still standing despite years of decay. Strange symbols were scratched into the planks, their meanings obscured by layers of soot and moss. Up close, the patterns seemed to shift and writhe, forming shapes that hurt the eyes to look at directly. Inside, the air was cold and stale, carrying the weight of centuries. A broken table stood in the center of the room, its surface marked with deep gouges that might have been made by claws or desperate human hands. Tattered fabric, possibly a curtain, hung limply from a corner, swaying slightly despite the absence of wind. The only source of light was Leah's flashlight, its beam seeming dim and inadequate against the pressing darkness. "This is incredible," she murmured, snapping pictures of the symbols on the walls. The camera's flash illuminated details they hadn't noticed. Dark stains on the floorboards, more symbols carved into the ceiling beams. Marcus stayed close to the doorway, his unease growing by the second. The air felt thick, almost liquid, and each breath seemed to draw something more than oxygen into his lungs. "Leah, I'm serious. We need to leave." "Just one more shot," she said, pointing her camera at the table. Her hands were steady, but her voice had taken on a distant quality, as if she were speaking from very far away. As the flash illuminated the room, something moved in the corner. Marcus froze, his breath catching in his throat. In that brief moment of artificial daylight, he had seen a figure, humanoid but wrong, its proportions distorted, as if viewed through warped glass. "Did you see that?" he whispered, fear making his voice crack. Leah lowered her camera slowly, her movements suddenly uncertain. "What?" "There's someone in here with us." Before Leah could respond, a faint whisper filled the room. It was too quiet to make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Pleading, desperate. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, as if the very walls were trying to speak. "Let's go," Marcus said, grabbing Leah's hand and pulling her toward the door. Her skin felt cold, almost waxy beneath his fingers. The whisper grew louder, joined by others until the air was filled with a chorus of voices. They spoke in overlapping fragments, their words disjointed but full of sorrow. Some seemed to be begging, others warning, and still others spoke in languages neither of them recognized. Leah's flashlight flickered as they stumbled into the clearing. its beam growing weaker with each pulse. The whispers didn't stop. They seemed to follow, growing louder with every step, becoming more urgent, more insistent. Then they saw it. The lantern. It was floating in the clearing, but this time, it wasn't alone. Shadows moved around it, their shapes indistinct but humanoid. They swayed with the light, their movements slow and deliberate, like dancers in a macabre ballet. As they watched, the shadows seemed to reach toward them with elongated limbs. "What the hell is this?" Leah whispered, her camera forgotten at her side. Marcus didn't answer. He was too busy dragging her toward the forest. "Run!" he hissed, his grip on her hand painful now. They sprinted through the trees, the whispers trailing after them like a cold wind. The lantern followed, its glow bobbing eerily in the distance. No matter how fast they ran, it seemed to stay just behind them, lighting the way for the shadows that flowed like smoke through the darkness. When they finally reached the main trail, the whispers stopped abruptly, leaving behind a silence that rang in their ears. The lantern flickered once, then disappeared, taking its shadows with it. Leah and Marcus collapsed onto the path, gasping for air that seemed too thin, too empty after the thickness of what they'd left behind. "What was that?" Leah asked, her voice trembling. Her hands shook as she checked her camera, needing the familiar comfort of its solid weight. "I don't know," Marcus said, helping her to her feet, "but we're not sticking around to find out." His academic interest in local history had been replaced by a primal need to be anywhere but here. They made it back to their car as the last light of day faded, leaving the forest cloaked in darkness. As they drove away, Leah glanced back, half expecting to see the lantern floating between the trees. The forest seemed to watch their departure with ancient, patient malevolence. They never spoke of the encounter again, but Leah's photos told a chilling story. Among the shots of the ruins were several she didn't remember taking. Pictures of the lantern, glowing softly against the blackened walls, surrounded by faint, shadowy figures. In some frames, the figures seemed to be reaching toward the camera, their features almost visible in the golden light. And in the final image, barely visible in the corner, was a face, neither human nor animal, its eyes reflecting the lantern's light with an impossible hunger. The meadow was a hidden gem, soft moss underfoot, wildflowers swaying in the breeze, and a canopy of trees that whispered secrets to the wind. Rays of late afternoon sunlight filtered through the leaves, casting dappled shadows that danced across the ground like nature's own light show. The air carried the sweet scent of wild honeysuckle and fresh earth, untainted by the artificial fragrances of civilization. It was exactly the kind of spot Emily and Jake had been searching for, remote, untouched, and perfect for their weekend of camping. "This place is unreal," Emily said, dropping her backpack and spinning in a slow circle to take it all in. Her boots sank slightly into the springy moss, leaving temporary impressions that slowly filled themselves in, as if the ground were healing itself. "Feels like something out of a fairy tale." "Minus the creepy witches and trolls," Jake teased, setting down the tent poles with a metallic clank that seemed oddly intrusive in the natural silence. He ran a hand through his dark hair, already damp with sweat from the hike in. "But yeah, it's pretty great." The clearing stretched before them like a perfect circle, roughly 50 feet in diameter, surrounded by ancient oaks whose gnarled branches reached toward each other overhead, creating a natural dome. Wild violets and Queen Anne's lace dotted the moss-covered ground, their delicate petals trembling in the occasional breeze that found its way through the trees. They spent the next hour setting up their tent, arranging their gear, and lighting a small fire. Emily arranged stones in a circle for the fire pit, noting how unusually warm they felt despite being in the shade. Jake gathered fallen branches from the edge of the clearing, careful not to disturb the pristine meadow more than necessary. The sun dipped low on the horizon, bathing the meadow in warm hues of orange and pink. The changing light transformed the peaceful clearing, lengthening shadows and creating deep pockets of darkness between the trees. It was everything they'd hoped for, a reprieve from the constant hum of city life, from the endless meetings and deadlines that had been wearing them down. But as night fell, the meadow began to change. It started subtly. Emily was lying on her back, staring up at the stars that were just beginning to peek through the canopy of leaves, when she felt a faint vibration beneath her. The sensation crawled up through the moss, through her sleeping pad, like the ghost of an earthquake. At first, she thought it was her imagination, or a trick of the breeze, perhaps her own pulse echoing through the ground. She shifted, pressing her palms against the mossy ground. There it was again, a rhythmic tremor, almost like breathing, with the steady rise and fall of a sleeping giant. "Jake," she said, sitting up, her voice catching slightly in her throat. "Do you feel that?" Jake looked up from the fire, where he'd been absently poking at the embers with a stick. His brow furrowed, creating deep lines across his forehead that looked almost black in the firelight. "Feel what?" "Like the ground is moving." She gestured for him to join her, her hand trembling slightly as she patted the moss beside her. The vibration seemed to intensify at her touch, as if responding to her attention. Jake walked over and knelt beside her, his movements careful, measured. He pressed his hands to the ground, frowning as he concentrated. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, just as he was about to shrug it off, he felt it, a subtle rise and fall, as if the earth itself were inhaling. The moss beneath his palms seemed to pulse with an inner warmth that had nothing to do with the lingering heat of the day. "Whoa," he said, leaning back, his face pale in the growing darkness. "That's weird." "You think it's some kind of geothermal thing?" Emily asked, her voice tinged with unease. She wrapped her arms around herself, though the air wasn't cold. The stars overhead seemed dimmer now, as if they too were holding their breath. "Maybe." Jake forced a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "It's probably nothing. Just the ground settling or something." But his voice lacked conviction, and his eyes kept darting to the shadows at the edge of the clearing, which seemed to have grown darker and more substantial. Emily wasn't convinced, but she didn't press the issue. They returned to the fire, trying to focus on the crackling flames and the scent of roasting marshmallows. The familiar camping ritual felt hollow now, a thin veneer of normalcy over something increasingly wrong. As the hours passed, the vibrations grew stronger. The moss beneath their feet seemed to ripple with each pulse, like skin over a beating heart. By the time they crawled into their tent, the ground felt alive beneath them, warm and pulsing, in a way that made sleep impossible. Emily lay awake, listening to Jake's measured breathing beside her, knowing he was only pretending to sleep. The sleeping bag beneath them did little to mask the movement of the earth, which now felt less like breathing and more like something massive shifting in its sleep. The air inside the tent grew thick and heavy, carrying an organic smell that reminded her of overturned soil and decay. Sometime after midnight, a low groaning sound woke them both. Jake bolted upright, his heart hammering so hard Emily could hear it over the sound of their ragged breathing. "What was that?" Emily's eyes were wide, her face pale in the dim glow of the tent. Moonlight filtered through the thin fabric, casting everything in a sickly blue light that made the shadows dance and writhe. "I don't know. It sounded close." They sat in silence, straining to hear over the pounding of their own hearts. The groaning came again, deep, resonant, and almost organic. It wasn't the cry of an animal or the creak of trees in the wind. It sounded like the earth itself was in pain, a sound that seemed to emanate from somewhere far below the surface, yet vibrated through their bones. The temperature inside the tent dropped several degrees, their breath forming small clouds in the air. Jake unzipped the tent and stepped outside, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The beam seemed weak, as if the darkness was actively resisting it. Emily followed, clutching her jacket tightly around her. The meadow looked the same as it had during the day, but the air felt heavier, as if it carried a warning. The moss beneath their feet had taken on a strange, silvery sheen in the moonlight, and the wildflowers had closed their petals tight, as if trying to protect themselves from what was coming. "Maybe we should leave," Emily whispered, her words forming frost in the unnaturally cold air. "Leave and go where?" Jake asked, scanning the area. His flashlight beam trembled as he swept it across the clearing. "We're miles from the car, and hiking back in the dark isn't exactly safe." The trees at the edge of the clearing seemed to have grown closer, their branches reaching toward the center like grasping fingers. Emily opened her mouth to reply, but another groan interrupted her. This time it was louder, so loud it seemed to vibrate through their bones, rattling their teeth and blurring their vision. The ground beneath their feet trembled, sending ripples through the moss like waves across a dark sea. The air grew thick with the smell of wet earth and something else, something ancient and wrong. Jake stumbled back, his flashlight beam jerking wildly across the clearing. The moving light created strange shadows that seemed to dance and twist independently of what cast them. What the hell is going on? Before Emily could answer, the ground shifted. A section of moss near the center of the meadow rose several feet, like a chest expanding with breath. Dirt crumbled away, revealing jagged, stony protrusions that gleamed in the moonlight like exposed bone. The moss slid off in sheets, revealing something dark and organic beneath, something that pulsed with its own inner light. "It's moving," Emily said, her voice barely a whisper. Her legs felt weak, rooted to the spot as if the very ground was holding her in place. Jake grabbed her arm, his fingers digging in hard enough to bruise. "We're leaving. Now." They didn't bother packing their gear. Jake grabbed a flashlight and their water bottles, and they started toward the forest. But the ground heaved again, nearly knocking them off their feet. Another groan, long and guttural, echoed through the meadow, louder than before. The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once, as if they were standing inside the throat of some massive creature. Emily glanced over her shoulder and froze. The entire meadow was moving now, rising and falling in great, undulating waves. The moss had torn away in places, revealing something dark and writhing beneath, something that glistened wetly in the moonlight. The trees at the edge of the clearing swayed violently, their roots exposed as the earth buckled. Some of the roots seemed to move of their own accord, twisting and reaching like tentacles. "It's alive," she whispered, the words slipping out before she could stop them. The truth of it hit her like a physical blow. They weren't standing on ground at all, but on something else, something that had been sleeping here for who knew how long. Jake didn't argue. He grabbed her hand and pulled her toward the trees, their feet slipping on the trembling ground. Behind them, the meadow let out another groan, this one sharper and more urgent, almost angry. The sound of tearing earth filled the air as something massive began to shift beneath the surface. They stumbled into the forest, the canopy swallowing them in darkness. The ground here was steadier, though the vibrations still lingered, faint but persistent, like aftershocks from an earthquake. They didn't stop running until their legs gave out, collapsing against a fallen log that felt blessedly solid and dead beneath them. "What the hell was that?" Jake gasped, his breath ragged. His flashlight flickered weakly, the beam barely penetrating the darkness that pressed in around them. "I don't know," Emily said, her voice trembling. She could still feel the warmth of the living earth through her boots, could still smell that ancient organic scent that clung to their clothes. But it wasn't natural. That's not something the ground just does. They sat in silence, the forest around them eerily quiet. Not even the crickets or owls made a sound. It was as if the entire world was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The darkness between the trees seemed to pulse with its own rhythm now, synchronized with the beating they could still feel through the ground. "We should keep moving," Jake said finally, his voice hoarse. "The car isn't far. If we follow the trail—" A new sound interrupted him. A faint, rhythmic thumping, like massive footsteps or a giant heart beating beneath the earth. It came from the direction of the meadow, growing louder with each beat. The fallen log beneath them began to vibrate in response, and small stones skittered across the ground with each impact. "Is it following us?" Emily asked, her voice barely audible over the sound of approaching doom. Jake didn't answer. He grabbed her hand and started running again, the flashlight beam bouncing erratically off trees that seemed to lean toward them as they passed. The thumping grew louder, closer, until it felt like the entire forest was shaking. The air grew thick with that organic smell again, and Emily could have sworn she heard something massive moving through the trees behind them, though she dared not look back. They stumbled onto the trail, their boots crunching over gravel. The car was just ahead, parked at the edge of the forest, its metal surface gleaming dully in the moonlight. Jake fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking so badly he dropped them twice before managing to unlock the doors. They scrambled inside, slamming the doors behind them. The small space felt impossibly fragile against whatever was pursuing them. Jake turned the key in the ignition, but the car sputtered and died, as if something was draining its energy. The dashboard lights flickered weakly, then went dark. No, he muttered, trying again. The engine coughed, but refused to start. Each failed attempt seemed to drain more power, the interior lights growing dimmer with each turn of the key. The thumping was deafening now, each beat rattling the car on its suspension. Emily clutched Jake's arm, her eyes wide with terror as she stared through the windshield. The trees ahead of them swayed in perfect rhythm with the beats, though there was no wind. "Try again," she screamed, her voice nearly lost in the cacophony of sound. Jake turned the key one last time, and the engine roared to life with a sound that seemed almost defiant. He slammed the car into gear, gravel spraying as they sped down the dirt road. The headlights cut through the darkness ahead, but Emily couldn't shake the feeling that the darkness was following them, reaching for them with tendrils of shadow. Behind them, the thumping faded, replaced by a low, mournful groan that seemed to echo through the entire forest. It sounded almost like disappointment, as if something ancient had just missed its prey. They didn't stop driving until they reached the highway, the familiar asphalt and streetlights offering little comfort. Even then, they didn't speak. The memory of the meadow still fresh in their minds. The organic smell lingered in their clothes and hair, a reminder that what they'd experienced had been terrifyingly real. Later, when they tried to find the meadow on a map, it was gone. The trail, the clearing, everything they remembered had vanished, as if the land itself had swallowed it whole. The topographical lines showed only unbroken forest where they knew the meadow had been. Neither of them ever went camping again, but sometimes, on quiet nights when they lie in bed, they press their ears to the ground and listen, wondering if somewhere, deep beneath the earth, something ancient is still breathing, still waiting for its next visitors to stumble upon its hiding place. And sometimes, they swear they can feel it. Local hikers whispered about trees that grew in unnatural spirals, their trunks twisted like DNA helixes reaching toward a greedy sky. Others swore that compasses went haywire deep in its heart, their needles spinning in frenzied circles before falling still, pointing toward something that wasn't quite north. Maps seemed to disagree about its exact boundaries, and GPS signals had a peculiar way of fading into static the deeper one ventured. But for Alan, Rosa, and Mitch, it was just another spot for a weekend escape. They weren't the superstitious type, dismissing such stories as nothing more than campfire fodder, the kind of tales locals told tourists to make their unremarkable woodland seem more interesting. The three friends arrived late in the afternoon, their weathered Subaru packed to the brim with tents, coolers, and significantly more beer than food, a testament to their priorities. The October air held that particular crispness that made everything feel more alive, more vital somehow. Shadows stretched long and thin across the dirt parking lot as they shouldered their packs, the weight of their camping gear settling against their backs like old friends. They hiked for about an hour, following a trail that seemed to fade with each step, until the path disappeared entirely beneath a thick carpet of fallen leaves. The trees pressed closer, their branches interweaving overhead to create a natural canopy that filtered the sunlight into strange, shifting patterns. When they finally stumbled upon a small clearing, it felt less like they had found it, and more like it had been waiting for them. The ground was soft and springy, covered in a thick layer of moss and decomposing leaves that muffled their footsteps. Ancient oaks stood sentinel around the perimeter, their massive trunks scarred with age. It was obvious someone had camped there before. Too obvious, perhaps. In the center of the clearing, a perfect circle of blackened stones sat like a dark pupil in a green iris, their edges worn suspiciously smooth, as if countless hands had caressed them over countless years. "Looks like we've got a ready-made fire pit," Mitch said, dropping his pack beside the circle with a heavy thud that seemed to echo longer than it should have. "Whoever was here last did us a favor." His voice carried a forced cheerfulness, as if he were trying to convince himself as much as his friends. Rosa frowned, brushing back her auburn hair with fingers that trembled slightly. The movement caught a shaft of dying sunlight, making her hair appear momentarily like liquid copper. "It's kind of weird, don't you think?" she said, kneeling to examine the stones more closely. The stones are charred, but there's no ash or anything inside, not even old coals. Her fingers hovered over the stones, but didn't quite touch them. "And look how perfect the circle is, like it was measured out with a compass." Alan shrugged, but there was a tension in his shoulders that betrayed his casual tone. Maybe rain washed it away, or animals scattered it. Either way, it's perfect. Let's set up before it gets dark. He glanced at the sky, where the sun was already beginning to sink behind the trees, with unsettling speed. Rosa hesitated, staring at the circle. Something about it felt fundamentally wrong, though she couldn't articulate why. The stones seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it, creating a void in the center of the clearing that made her eyes want to slide away. Still, she didn't want to be the buzzkill of the group. They'd been planning this trip for weeks, and her friends had already teased her about being too cautious, too controlled. She helped set up the tents and gather firewood while Mitch built a fire, trying to ignore the way the circle of stones seemed to guide their movements, making it impossibly easy to arrange the logs in perfect symmetry. By the time the sun dipped below the trees, the fire was roaring with an intensity that seemed disproportionate to its size. The flames cast dancing shadows on their faces as they sat around it, drinking beer and roasting hot dogs on long sticks that Mitch had whittled to points. The meat sizzled and popped, fat dripping into the flames with a sound like whispered conversations. Mitch told jokes that had Alan in stitches, their laughter echoing strangely in the still air, while Rosa sipped quietly, her eyes often drifting to the trees that seemed to lean inward, as if listening. The darkness beyond their circle of firelight was absolute, a tangible presence that pressed against their backs like cold hands. The woods had fallen into an unnatural silence, broken only by the crack and pop of burning wood and their increasingly forced conversation. "What's up, Rosa?" Alan asked, nudging her with his elbow, making her jump. His smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "You've been weird all day. Barely touched your beer." "It's nothing," she said, forcing a smile that felt like a grimace. "Just tired. Work's been crazy." The lie tasted bitter on her tongue. "Or creeped out," Mitch teased, wagging his fingers in an exaggerated gesture. The firelight caught his hands, making his fingers appear longer than they should be, like twisted branches. "Come on, admit it." You've been staring at that fire pit like it's cursed or something. Like any minute now, something's going to crawl out of it." "It's not that," Rosa said, though her tone wasn't convincing even to her own ears. Her fingers tightened around her bottle until her knuckles turned white. "It's just, this place feels wrong. The fire pit, the quiet. Have you noticed we haven't heard any animals? No birds, no bugs, nothing. Even the wind seems wrong. It's like the air is dead." Alan laughed, but it was a hollow sound that died quickly in the thick air. "We're in the middle of the woods. What did you expect? Traffic sounds." He took another long drink from his beer, as if trying to wash away his own unease. Mitch grinned and raised his bottle, the gesture slightly too wide, slightly too desperate. "To no traffic and no noise. Cheers to peace and quiet." The bottles clinked together with a sound that seemed to echo far longer than it should have, like bells tolling in an empty church. Rosa clinked her bottle reluctantly, but her unease had taken root and grown into something darker. The fire crackled and spat, sending sparks spiraling into the night like tiny lost stars. As the evening wore on, the three friends settled into a more subdued rhythm, their conversation dwindling to sporadic comments and nervous laughter. The beer took its toll eventually, and they retreated to their tents, leaving the fire to burn itself out. None of them mentioned how strange it was that the wood seemed endless, the flames never diminishing despite the hours that had passed. Rosa woke in the middle of the night to a strange sound that slithered into her consciousness like a cold finger down her spine. It was faint at first, like the shuffle of feet over dry leaves, but wrong somehow, too rhythmic, too deliberate. She lay perfectly still in her sleeping bag, straining to hear over the pounding of her heart. The sound grew louder, accompanied by low whispers that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The voices were indistinct but undeniably human, speaking words that almost made sense, like a conversation heard underwater. She sat up slowly, fumbling for her flashlight with trembling fingers. The tent felt suffocating, its nylon walls suddenly seeming as insubstantial as tissue paper. The whispers pressed against the fabric like probing hands, and the air inside had grown thick and cold, carrying a scent like wet ashes and decay. Taking a deep breath that tasted of smoke, she unzipped the tent with agonizing slowness and peered out. The fire was still burning. It should have died hours ago, but the flames danced higher than before, reaching toward the starless sky with hungry fingers. The light it cast was wrong, too blue, too cold, creating long shadows that seemed to move independently of the flames. Around the fire pit, figures moved in a slow, deliberate circle, silent, shrouded shapes that seemed to flicker in and out of existence like smoke caught in a draft. Their movements were synchronized, a dance to music she couldn't hear but could feel vibrating in her bones. Rosa froze, her hand tightening around the flashlight until the plastic creaked in protest. The shapes were human-like, but fundamentally wrong, as if someone had tried to create people from half-remembered descriptions. Their limbs were too long, joints bending at impossible angles, their movements too jerky and precise, like puppets being manipulated by an unseen puppeteer with cruel intentions. "Mitch," she hissed through lips gone numb with fear, trying to wake him without attracting attention. "Alan!" Her whispered calls seemed to be swallowed by the unnatural silence, disappearing into the void like stones dropped in a bottomless well. Neither of them stirred, though she could see their tents clearly in the fire's otherworldly light. The whispers grew louder, forming patterns that almost resolved into words. Almost, but not quite. And somehow that was worse than if they had been clearly understood. One of the figures turned toward her tent, its movement sharp and unnatural, like a video played in reverse. Its face was a void, a black emptiness that seemed to suck in the light, creating a hole in reality that made her eyes water and her mind recoil. Rosa clapped a hand over her mouth to stifle a scream that clawed at her throat like a living thing. She ducked back into the tent, her heart thundering so loudly she was certain the creatures outside must hear it. Her mind raced through options that crumbled to dust as soon as she grasped them. She couldn't stay there, not with those things outside, but she couldn't leave her friends behind, to whatever fate awaited them. Steeling herself with a courage born of desperation, she grabbed her heavy metal flashlight, grateful now for Alan's insistence on over-preparing, and a small camping knife that seemed pathetically inadequate against the horrors outside. The blade caught the firelight as she pulled it from its sheath, reflecting that unnatural blue glow. She crawled out of the tent, staying low to the ground, her movements slow and deliberate. The figures didn't seem to notice her, their attention fixed on the fire with an intensity that made the air shimmer around them. As she reached Mitch's tent, she could hear him breathing, too slow, too deep, as if he were trapped in a sleep deeper than natural. She shook his shoulder violently, her fingers digging into his flesh through the sleeping bag. "Mitch, wake up," she whispered harshly, her voice raw with fear. "Please, please, wake up." He groaned, rubbing his eyes with clumsy movements. "What the hell, Rosa?" His voice was thick with sleep and confusion. "Shh," she hissed, pressing her hand against his mouth. "There's something out there. Something wrong." Mitch tried to push her hand away, but his annoyance faded as he saw her expression in the strange light that filtered through the tent walls. "What are you talking about?" His whisper was barely audible, but fear had already crept into his tone. "The fire," she said, pointing with a shaking hand. "Look." Mitch crawled to the tent flap and peeked out, his movements still sluggish, as if moving through syrup. His face paled to a sickly gray as he saw the figures, all color draining away except for the reflected blue of the flames. "What the hell?" The words came out as a strangled whisper. They scrambled to wake Alan, who was equally difficult to rouse. When his eyes finally opened, they were glazed and distant, like someone coming out of anesthesia. The three huddled together in his tent, whispering frantically, their breath creating clouds of vapor in the unnaturally cold air. "We need to leave," Rosa said, her words tumbling over each other in their rush to escape. "Now, before they notice us." "How?" Mitch asked, running his hands through his hair repeatedly, a nervous gesture that made him look half mad in the ethereal light. "Our gear's right next to the fire, and those things are in the way." His voice cracked on the word things, as if his mind refused to provide a better description. "We'll go around," Alan said, trying to sound braver than he felt. His face was a mask of forced calm, but his eyes were wide with primal fear. "Stay low, stay quiet." Like Rosa did, they seemed focused on the fire. They gathered their essentials with trembling hands, phones, car keys, wallets, leaving everything else behind. Moving as one, they began to edge toward the tree line, staying as far from the fire pit as possible. The figures continued their eternal circle, their movements creating patterns that hurt the eyes to follow. The whispers had taken on a rhythmic quality, rising and falling like waves on a dead sea. They had almost reached the tree line when one of the shapes stopped mid-step. The sudden cessation of movement was like a scratch across reality. It turned its faceless head toward them with mechanical precision, and the whispers ceased, leaving a silence so complete it felt like a physical pressure against their eardrums. "Run," Rosa breathed, the word more a movement of lips than a sound. They bolted into the forest, abandoning all pretense of stealth. Branches whipped at their faces and caught at their clothes like grasping hands. The sound of their passage seemed obscenely loud in the unnatural quiet, until it was joined by other sounds, cracking branches and heavy footsteps that didn't match their rhythm, and whispers that grew in volume and anger, surrounding them as if the forest itself had awakened with malevolent intent. Rosa's foot caught on a root that seemed to rise up from the ground to meet her. She cried out as she hit the ground, the impact driving the air from her lungs. Mitch and Alan hauled her up with desperate strength, their breaths coming in ragged gasps that frosted in the inexplicably cold air. Through the trees, the firelight was visible again, impossibly close, its blue glow seeming to reach for them with eager fingers. "We're going in circles," Alan said, panic rising in his voice like a tide. "The clearing, it's pulling us back." The whispers grew deafening, taking on a harmonious quality that made their teeth ache and their vision blur. A deep, guttural groan emanated from the earth beneath their feet, as if something massive were stirring from ancient slumber. Rosa turned to see the figures emerging from between the trees, their forms flickering like dying flames, leaving trails of darkness in their wake. "This way!" Mitch shouted, his voice cracking with terror as he spotted a faint break in the trees, a gap that seemed to promise escape. They burst through the tree line into an open field, the whispers fading like a radio losing signal. The normal sounds of night, crickets, distant owls, the rustle of wind through grass, rushed back with blessed familiarity. They didn't stop running until they reached the dirt road where their car was parked, its ordinary metal frame the most beautiful thing any of them had ever seen. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting the forest in an innocent golden glow that made the night's horrors seem like a shared nightmare. They never spoke about what they'd seen, not really. The experience sat between them like a weight whenever they met, making casual conversation impossible. Their camping gear remained in the forest, abandoned to whatever fate awaited it. Days later, when Mitch worked up the courage to return in broad daylight, the clearing was gone, if it had ever truly existed. The trees had closed ranks, presenting an unbroken wall of vegetation. There was no sign of a fire pit or a campsite, no trace of their abandoned gear, just an unbroken expanse of forest that watched him with ancient patience, silent and unwelcoming. Sometimes, on cold nights when the moon is dark, Rosa dreams of blue flames and figures dancing in perfect circles. She wakes to the sound of whispers that fade with the dawn, leaving behind the certainty that somewhere in those woods, a circle of stones waits in the darkness, hungry for new visitors to gather around its perfect circumference. A lot of the locals said that the forest had a voice. People called it Shriek Hollow, a stretch of dense woods in the hills outside of town that seemed to pulse with its own dark energy. Some swore it was just the wind funneled through the steep ridges. Others claimed it was a trick of the natural acoustics. But the stories, the ones about hikers who went missing after hearing the cries, were enough to give even seasoned outdoorsmen pause. The tales stretched back generations, whispered around campfires, and passed down like family heirlooms. Stories of shadows that moved against the wind, of voices that called your name in the dark, of people who walked into those woods and emerged changed, if they emerged at all. Kelly and her fiancé, Tom, weren't superstitious. They rolled their eyes at the legends when they picked the hollow for a weekend camping trip, dismissing them as small-town folklore meant to keep tourists away from the best hiking spots. Both were experienced hikers who had tackled more challenging trails across the country. The trail promised solitude, stunning views, and a sense of accomplishment, a perfect escape from the city grind and their high-pressure jobs in finance. They needed this break, this chance to reconnect away from the endless emails and midnight conference calls. The first day went as planned, though there were subtle signs they chose to ignore. They started their hike at dawn, the crisp autumn air invigorating as they followed the winding path into the hills. The trees were a riot of color, their leaves carpeting the forest floor in gold and rust, creating a deceptively beautiful tapestry that masked the hollow's true nature. The trail itself seemed to resist them at times, with roots that appeared to shift beneath their feet, and branches that caught at their clothes like grasping fingers. By midday, they reached a small plateau where they set up camp, their tent tucked under a canopy of fiery red oaks whose branches intertwined overhead like ancient guardians. From there, they could see the tops of the ridges, shadowed and mysterious as the sun dipped lower, casting long fingers of darkness across the landscape. The view was breathtaking, but something about it felt wrong, as though they were looking at a painting of a forest rather than the real thing. Kelly noticed the silence first, though she tried to dismiss it. The typical forest sounds, bird calls, rustling leaves, scampering wildlife, were conspicuously absent, replaced by a heavy stillness that seemed to watch and wait. As they ate dinner by the campfire, Kelly pulled her jacket tighter, fighting against a chill that seemed to come from within rather than without. The air had grown colder than she'd expected, with a bitter edge that cut through their layers of technical gear. "This place is amazing," Tom said, between bites of a sandwich, his breath visible in the growing darkness. Quiet, remote, perfect for getting away from it all. His voice sounded different here, slightly muffled, as though the forest were absorbing his words. Kelly nodded, though she couldn't shake a sense of unease that had been building since they crossed the hollow's threshold. "Yeah, but it's almost too quiet, don't you think? Like there's no wind, no animals." She glanced around at the surrounding trees, their bark black with shadows that seemed to writhe in the firelight. "Probably the season," Tom said with a shrug, his forced casualness betraying his own discomfort. "Animals hunker down when it gets colder." Even as he spoke, his eyes darted to the tree line, tracking movements that vanished when looked at directly. Kelly didn't argue, but the quiet wasn't the only thing bothering her. There was something about the way the shadows pooled at the edges of the forest, as though the trees were huddling together, hiding something. The darkness between the trunks seemed deeper than it should be, more absolute, as if light itself feared to penetrate too far into the hollow. They settled into the tent early, planning to get up with the sunrise and explore deeper into the hollow, though neither spoke of the growing reluctance they felt about that plan. The synthetic walls of their tent felt impossibly thin, offering little protection from whatever waited in the darkness beyond. Kelly had just drifted into a light sleep, her dreams filled with whispering voices and moving shadows, when a noise jolted her awake. A scream. It cut through the silence, high-pitched and piercing, echoing off the ridges with an unnatural resonance that made her teeth ache. It wasn't the sound of an animal or the wind. It carried too much intention, too much malice. Kelly shot upright, her heart pounding against her ribs like it was trying to escape. "Tom!" she hissed, shaking him. Her hands trembled as they gripped his shoulder, her fingers white-knuckled with fear. "What? What's wrong?" he asked groggily, his voice thick with sleep. The temperature in the tent had dropped dramatically, their breath forming ghostly patterns in the darkness. "Did you hear that?" Kelly's whisper was barely audible, as though speaking too loudly might draw attention they didn't want. Tom rubbed his eyes, sitting up in his sleeping bag. "Hear what?" Another scream. This one was sharper, closer, with harmonics that shouldn't exist in nature. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, filling the space between trees with its terrible sound. Tom sat up fully now, his expression hardening as the last vestiges of sleep fled. "What the hell?" The color had drained from his face, leaving him pale in the weak moonlight that filtered through the tent fabric. "It sounded human," Kelly said, her voice trembling, like someone's hurt. But even as she said it, she knew that wasn't quite right. It sounded like something trying to sound human and not quite succeeding. Tom grabbed the flashlight from his pack and unzipped the tent with shaking hands. The forest was pitch black beyond the small glow of their dying campfire, the darkness seeming to push against the light like a living thing. He swung the flashlight in a wide arc, illuminating nothing but trees and shadows that appeared to recoil from the beam. "Hello?" he called, his voice steady despite his fear. "Is someone out there?" No response, just the hollow's oppressive silence swallowing his words. Kelly crawled out of the tent behind him, clutching her jacket against both the cold and her rising panic. What if it's someone lost or hurt? Should we look? The words felt wrong even as she spoke them, driven by a lifetime of social conditioning that didn't apply here. Tom hesitated, shifting his weight from foot to foot. The scream had unnerved him more than he wanted to admit, challenging his rational worldview. Let's wait. If we hear it again, we'll check it out. But his tone suggested he hoped they wouldn't hear it again. They stood by the fire for what felt like an eternity, the silence pressing in on them like a physical weight. The flames cast dancing shadows that seemed to move independently of the fire's light, creating patterns that hurt the eyes if watched too closely. Just as Kelly started to relax, convinced they had imagined it all, the scream came again. Closer, impossibly close, though they could see no one. It was long and guttural, rising into a chilling wail that sent goosebumps crawling over her skin and set her nerve endings on fire. "That's not human," Tom said, his voice low and tight with fear. His hand found Kelly's in the darkness, their fingers interlocking with desperate strength. "Then what is it?" Kelly whispered, though part of her didn't want to know the answer. Before he could answer, the forest erupted with sound. Branches snapped with gunshot cracks, leaves rustled with unnatural intensity, and heavy footsteps echoed from multiple directions, surrounding them in a cacophony of movement. Kelly clutched Tom's arm, her breath shallow and quick, fighting against the urge to run blindly into the darkness. The screams came again, overlapping now, as though there were dozens of voices surrounding them. Each cry held a different pitch, a different texture of agony or rage or hunger, a chorus of the damned, performing their terrible symphony. "Get the fire going," Tom said, his voice tight with controlled panic. "Now!" Kelly scrambled to gather wood, her hands shaking so badly she could barely grip the branches. Each piece she picked up felt wrong, too cold, too smooth, as though the wood itself had been transformed by whatever force ruled this place. Tom threw the pieces onto the glowing embers and fanned them frantically until the flames roared back to life, casting a circle of warmth and light that felt impossibly fragile. The light pushed the darkness back a few feet, but it didn't feel like enough. Nothing would have felt like enough. The sounds continued, circling them with predatory patience. The footsteps moved closer, stopping just beyond the firelight's reach. Kelly squinted into the dark but could see nothing. No animals, no people, just the faint shimmer of movement, like shadows detaching themselves from the trees. The shapes seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, creating holes in reality where nothing should exist. "Tom," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, her throat constricted with terror. "I see it," he replied, gripping a metal trekking pole like a weapon, though they both knew it would be useless against whatever waited in the darkness. The figures were indistinct, little more than shifting silhouettes, but their presence was suffocating. The air grew heavier, colder, and Kelly felt a pressure in her chest, as though the forest itself were closing in. The temperature dropped so low that ice crystals began forming on their sleeping bags, and their breath came out in thick, white clouds that hung motionless in the air. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. The shadows froze, melting back into the trees like ink spreading through water. The forest was silent once more, but it was the silence of a predator waiting to strike. Kelly and Tom didn't move, their eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. The fire crackled weakly, its light seeming dimmer than it should be, as though something were feeding on its energy. "What just happened?" Kelly finally whispered, though she knew there could be no rational explanation for what they had witnessed. "I don't know," Tom said, his earlier skepticism shattered. "But we're not staying to find out." They grabbed what they could carry and doused the fire, leaving the campsite in disarray. Their flashlight beams cut through the darkness as they hurried down the trail, their breaths visible in the icy air. The beams seemed weaker than they should be, barely penetrating the unnatural darkness that pressed in around them. The screams returned within minutes, louder and more desperate, filled with a horrible hunger that made Kelly's soul shrivel. She broke into a run, her pulse pounding in her ears like war drums. The trail twisted and turned, the trees blurring as she sprinted past. Tom was just behind her, urging her forward, his voice tight with fear and exertion. "We're close," he said between gasping breaths. "The car's just ahead." But when they burst out of the forest and onto the dirt road where they'd parked, the car was gone. The clearing where it should have been was empty, as if they'd never been there. Even the gravel where they'd parked showed no sign of disturbance, as though reality itself had been rewritten in their absence. "This can't be right," Tom said, spinning in a circle, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness in increasingly frantic arcs. "We parked right here." Kelly turned back toward the forest, her stomach sinking as she saw what approached. The shadows were moving again, spilling out of the trees and onto the road like an oil slick given life. They seemed more solid now, more defined, though looking directly at them caused a vertigo that threatened to overwhelm her sanity. "Tom, run!" she screamed, her voice raw with terror. They bolted down the road, their footsteps crunching on the gravel in a desperate rhythm. The shadows followed, gaining ground with each passing second, moving with a liquid grace that defied physics. The screams grew deafening, overlapping until they became a single, ear-splitting howl that contained all the pain and madness in the universe. Just when Kelly thought her legs would give out, when the shadows were close enough that she could feel their cold touch on the back of her neck, they saw headlights in the distance. A truck was approaching, its engine a welcome roar in the chaos, its lights cutting through the darkness like divine intervention. They ran into the middle of the road, waving their arms frantically, knowing this might be their only chance at survival. The truck skidded to a stop, and the driver, a grizzled man in his 60s with eyes that had seen too much, stared at them in shock, his weathered face pale in the dashboard lights. "What the hell's going on?" he asked, though his expression suggested he already knew. "Drive!" Tom shouted, yanking the door open with such force it nearly came off its hinges. "Get us out of here!" The man didn't argue. He threw the truck into gear and sped down the road, leaving the forest behind in a spray of gravel. Kelly looked out the rear window, half expecting to see the shadows chasing them, but the road was empty. Yet somehow that emptiness was worse. It suggested that whatever lived in Shriek Hollow had simply allowed them to escape, confident they would return one day. By the time they reached the nearest town, the screams were little more than a memory that would haunt them for the rest of their lives, surfacing in nightmares that left them gasping in the dark. Their camping gear remained in the hollow, abandoned to whatever forces claimed that cursed place, and they never tried to retrieve it. Kelly and Tom never spoke of what happened in Shriek Hollow, never tried to explain the inexplicable to others who wouldn't understand. But whenever they drove past the forest, they rolled up the windows and kept their eyes fixed firmly on the road, the faint echo of a scream lingering in their minds. And sometimes, on particularly dark nights, they would wake to the sound of branches scratching at their window, though no trees grew near their city apartment. In those moments, they would hold each other tight and wait for dawn, knowing that something in Shriek Hollow was waiting, watching, remembering, and calling them back.